So the question I wanted to ask in this video was, where can we find the reason behind some of the requirements in BS 7671? And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because a few years ago I did the electrical design course, and the one thing that I took away from that more than anything else is that in the exam there were some questions that asked to state what is the requirement in BS 7671, and there were some questions that asked to state the reasons behind the requirement in BS 7671. Now obviously the first question, you know, if you're asked to state what is a particular requirement, I remember one question I got was state the BS number for bonding clamps, so that was relatively easy to find in the regs book. But other questions where it asked you to state the reason behind or explain the reason behind the requirements in BS 7671 were a little bit more difficult to find the answer in the regs book. And I think that the thing that I found is that when you're allowed to take the regs book into the exam with you, I think it's really tempting to try and find the word perfect textbook answer to the question in the regs book. But there are some questions where you might not necessarily find the answer in the regs book. So the question is, where do you find that information? Now the first thing that I'd point out though is that one thing that you will find in the regs book is the regulation numbers and everything that you need to justify the answer, and that is just as important as getting the question right, is justifying the answer that you've given. So when you're answering your question, you're going to want to reference regulation number, so on and so forth, and you know, the relevant table number, whether it's table 43.1 or table 4AB or whatever it is. So for example, if you get a question that asks you to verify if a circuit complies with the maximum ZS, then obviously you're going to need to find that from the regs book. You need to look in the relevant table for that, for the protected device, and find that information from there and reference that in your answer. But in terms of those questions where you're asked to explain the reason behind something, a lot of the time you won't find that in the regs book. So where do we find it? Well, one tip that I can give you is the guidance notes. You'll probably be familiar with guidance notes 1 and 3, especially if you're a member of a competent person scheme. My advice would be, if you've got those on your bookshelf just waiting for your next assessment with your competent person scheme, is to make sure you have a read of them as well. They're really, really useful. There's also other guidance notebooks. There's guidance note 2, which I think is isolation and switching, guidance note 4, which I think is protection against fire, and then there's 5, 6, 7 and 8. Now guidance note 7 relates specifically to special locations, and that's a really, really useful book to read, especially if you're going to be doing the electrical design course like I did. But obviously if you're ever doing an exam, you won't be able to take that in there with you. You've only got your regs book, and so if you're looking through the regs book and you're trying to find, say the question asks you what are the risks associated with a special location such as an agricultural location, then it might be difficult to find the answer to that question, but obviously you'll find the relevant regulation numbers that you need to justify your answer. So the best thing to do if you're in that situation is to really think about what are the risks in that location. So if you think about it, one thing that's always going to be a risk in agricultural locations is rodents. So rodent damage to cables and the fire risks that that might present. Contact with the general mass of earth as well is a risk, obviously. So that's why there are specific requirements around bonding when it comes to agricultural locations. And so you've got specific requirements around the use of PME. Now PME is not recommended in agricultural locations, so I don't think it's prohibited, but it's not recommended. I talk about that more in another video in my channel, and I'll put a link at the top of the screen for that. So that's another thing. Contact with the general mass of earth. Moisture, there's always going to be a lot of moisture when you're open to the elements. So if I was asked that question, I would answer in my own words, and I would say rodent damage, risk of fire, moisture, contact with the general mass of earth. When you've got livestock present, I think they're more susceptible to electric shock than we are, because they've got 4 points of contact with the ground. So that's why there's that requirement around bonding of metal grids, for example. So the livestock are more susceptible, but also I think they present an extra hazard as well. So anything that you install has got to be suitable for that location. It's going to have the relevant IP rating, IK rating, which relates to impact protection as well. So it's thinking of things like that and answering questions like that in your own words. And that's what I would always recommend. If you see a question that asks you to explain something, to explain the reason behind something, is to try and get that answer down in your own words and really bring out your own knowledge that you've already got, and then to look in the regs book and to find the relevant regulation numbers to help justify your answer. I think that's the best way to go about it. So that's the one thing that I took away more than anything from doing that exam in the electrical design course, is to understand the difference between some of the questions that they're going to ask you. They're going to ask you some that ask you to state the requirement, which you're going to have to find in the regs book, and they'll ask you some questions that will ask you to explain it. And it's a really good idea to get it down in your own words, especially if you know the answer to the question. Really get it down on paper, and then go into the regs book and find the reg numbers to justify your answer. I hope you find that useful. And just to say that this is really based on my experience of having attended the course. I haven't any knowledge of what questions might potentially come up in an exam like that, but I think it's just a really good bit of advice for any written exam really, is to read the question and understand what they're asking you to tell them, really, because really bear in mind that they want to know what you know. They already know what it says in the regs book. They want to know what you know, and they want to know that you're able to justify your answer as well. So try and I would say try and avoid the temptation to copy out of the regs book, because I think that's a lot of the time that's not what they're looking for. Also, it can take up a lot of time as well, because in that exam you've only got 3 hours, or at least at the time that I did it, you only had 3 hours to answer all the questions, so it's a lot of work. So if you need to look in there to find the requirement, do that, but if it's asking you to explain something, it's best to explain it in your own words. And another thing that I found from doing that exam is that when I did the assignment wasn't due until after the exam was due, so it wouldn't be possible for me to finish the assignment in that time. But it's really important, I feel, to start the assignment as soon as possible so that you get the practice of all the calculations and everything. So if you were thinking of doing that course, that would be another piece of advice that I'd give you, is to start the assignment as soon as possible and get that practice on the calculations. I found it a bit of a juggling act trying to do that and revise for what questions might come up in the exam as well. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. But yeah, definitely getting on with the assignment is a really good thing. And then that's my other bit of advice, is to read those guidance notebooks. They're really useful, and also the on-site guide as well is a really good source of information, just to get some information on the reason behind the requirement and why those requirements exist. And just to bear in mind that you might not necessarily find the answer in the regs book itself. So I hope you found that useful. That's basically my tip on how to find the reason behind the requirements in the wiring regulations, is to check out those guidance notes. And if you want to see more videos like this, please click over here to subscribe to my channel.